Welcome to the ATX DAO Podcast, the hub for exploring the forefront of blockchain technology in Austin's Web3 community. We connect you with innovators within ATX DAO and beyond as we venture into the world of decentralized technology. So crack open a beer and join us for a front row seat to learn about the innovations and trends shaping our digital future. This is the ATX DAO Podcast. Welcome to the ATX DAO Podcast. We are excited today to welcome Toma from the Obol Association. He is the CEO, and Toma, we're excited to have you on the show, man. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so really excited to get into some of the details of what y'all are doing at Obol. So y'all do a lot of great things with decentralized validation and that type of thing. For listeners that may be new to learning about Obol, thought we just kind of start off with just a little bit of detail around kind of what Obol is, kind of why it was formed, those kind of things, and then we'll get into a little more of the details of how it works and some of the cool things y'all are working on.
Cool. Yeah. So today, Obol is the largest decentralized operator ecosystem and what we call the champion of distributed validators. And distributed validators are this more secure, more rewarding, more performance way of staking on decentralized networks like Ethereum, but we also recently launched on Monad and Gnosis Chain and other proof of stake network. Before we go too deep into validators and proof of stake and all that stuff, I like to preface this by saying it's nothing that new. What we're doing is really security and high availability software. And that's what everyone relies when they're on the internet every day. When you go on Google or ChatGPT or Grok these days, there is somewhere a server that you're querying. And a server is a machine and sometimes it's down. And so there are other servers that act as sort of a backup so that they can send the information and process whatever you requested, whether that's this latest Ghibli image like we saw yesterday take over Twitter. So this concept of high availability software and getting the resources and the reliability from like a network exists for a while. And so what we've done is just take that concept and bring it to proof of stake blockchain. And actually, that's not even us that did that. Vitalik added on his roadmap, if you remember, like the 5 stages of the roadmap. After the merge, the next box really is distributed validators. So we initially got a grant from the Ethereum Foundation, and that kind of trickled from there. And today we're close to 1 billion of stake securing the network this way. So it's been quite an exciting journey. And so maybe now it's useful to go a bit deeper, if that's okay, into the supply chain of staking. I don't know if that's useful for you listeners.
Yeah, no, that'd be fantastic.
Cool. So I like to start with the humans that are running the machines. In a blockchain, Ethereum style blockchain, proof of stake, at some point you still have humans or entities. They could be people like you and me. They could be like institutions like the Fidelities or of this world or Blockdaemon, Figment, very big name, or solo stakers. But there are humans that we call operators. And these have various knowledge about how to run what we call nodes. And so you have really two kinds of nodes in proof of stake blockchains. On the one side, you have the simple nodes, which are just relaying the transactions. And then you can transform your node in what we call a validator. And that's where you put stake, and it's the proof of stake name. In the case of Ethereum, that's 32 ETH. It can be your own stake or it can come from external sources. And then once your node is transformed into a validator, it's expected to do more than just relay the transactions of the network, but to validate them. And that's verifying whether they're valid, proposing some blocks. And every time you do that work, you get rewarded for it. But if you don't do that work, then you get penalized for it. And so that's the whole concept of proof of chain networks. Now, I said there are operators, and then there are machines, these validators that are being run. And now, humans are unpredictable, as we know. Machines are also unpredictable. I think we saw recently some of the validators from Lido DAO went offline because one of the data centers in South Africa lost internet. I think there was something else around the Los Angeles fires where some of the validators were offline. So a machine also sometimes loses internet connection, or there might be an upgrade like the Pectra upgrade that's coming up for Ethereum that you might forget to because you're having a nice holiday somewhere as an operator. So there is still a lot of overhead and reliance on both the humans and the software that's running those nodes. So what distributed validators really do is break down the validator between several machines so that if, let's say, 3 out of 4 machines are working correctly, or 3 out of 4 operators that are running these machines are still doing their job properly and not just chilling on the beach, not updating their machine, then the validator keeps running, keep earning rewards, and it's okay if one goes down. And you sort of have the strength in number as a group, which we call a cluster, and that's what forms a distributed validators. And so you can have different, let's say, data centers or cloud providers. We saw recently, I think it was Hertner, the German cloud provider that sort of banned node operators, Ethereum nodes. And so if that was just one node in your cluster, your validator keeps running, and that's not a problem. If there is a bug like we saw on some of the recent forks on testnet with some of the clients, your validator keeps running. So you get more uptime, more rewards, more performance. So that's good for you as your staker, but it's also very good for Ethereum because that means it's very resilient to also external attacks. We saw recently with the Tornado Cash sanctions that got lifted, that's great, but also the Bybit hack, there is always attacks going on, right? And these also go after operators and validators. So once you're distributed, you're much more resilient to these sort of attacks as well. So it's sort of like a security make sense software just to strengthen the network. And to this day, it feels like Ethereum is undefeated in terms of security, and it's very valuable for that as well. So we're glad to be supporting this effort to decentralize even further without compromising on performance or rewards.
I'd like to just ask a question on this. So, like, you know, I'd like to hear a little bit, like we touched on this a little bit earlier, but like that origin point. What was the problem that said, like, hey, we need to solve this problem, and this is the way we're thinking about solving this problem, right? Like, because DVT is built on a lot of like well-known cryptography like areas of study. Like SSS is a key component that is obviously there. You have the threshold schemes that are there, and obviously there's other things like TE and MPC that where you have components, well, MPC components in this kind of this architecture that you're built. But I'd like to hear what was that moment where we're like, oh fuck, guys, we need to solve this fucking problem if we really want this to work properly. This experiment that we're running with crypto and Ethereum.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. As the problem we set Obol on 3 years ago has actually changed than the one that we're solving today. And I'll explain in a minute why. So originally, the big problem that these proof of stake network, or especially Ethereum, had with these validators was slashing. So slashing is what happens when you have two validators that have the same private key that try to do the same action at the same time. That's like flagged as like malicious behavior, and you lose part of your stake. And I think there's been about like 30 slashing events since the beginning of Ethereum in various sizes, always detrimental to the capital holders, obviously. And the reason they happen most of the time is the operators always want to maximize the uptime. So they would have like their main machine that's validating somewhere, and then they would have like a backup that's offline. And if the main machine fails, they would spin up the backup. But then that software that was coordinating between the two had issues. And so both would come up online, sign a transaction, and then you get slashed. And so initially, that's what we had in mind with distributed validators, is that instead of having backups, you could just have full tolerance. By just running as a group, you have, let's say, 4 machines. And so if one goes down, 3 out of 4 is enough. So you didn't need these backups in the same way. They would just like all collaborate and rely on each other. So that was the initial full tolerance problem we were solving. And I think it's still very important to this degree, especially with the staking ETFs coming up, like the SEC and the issuers are going to expect very high like level of availability and zero slashing. These guys are not going to accept any slashing. But in terms of bootstrapping Obol, what we came to realize that was even more important, especially in the early days of liquid staking, which is when someone provides capital for these validators when you can't provide it yourself. So Lido or EtherFi, these are like protocols that take the money from other people like retail stakers or institutional and then distribute it to their operators. What we saw is that there was a bit of a lack of trust in these protocols because they were considered centralized and not having enough operators. Like, I don't know if you remember, but like a couple of years ago, everyone was shitting on Lido, really. They were like, they're controlling way too much of Ethereum, they're a bad actor. And so we started working with them. And since they adopted DVs, they actually went from 30 operators to 300. Now, how is that possible? Well, for the same reason that you can have fault tolerance in one operator running multiple machines, if you have several people that don't know each other running distributed validators, it's okay if one of them goes rogue. They can't really steal the money. They don't have the full private key. And so that meant Lido and EtherFi could start trusting people they didn't really know. And that's why they initially had like tight little groups, but suddenly they could expand, semi-trust people. And if that person wasn't performing, didn't keep their node online, they could just kick them out and change that person with someone else. It was not a big overhead and no loss in performance, no loss in rewards, and no added risk. So that was like the big adoption curve for us, was like these protocols that wanted to increase the node operator set, because that's what the community was demanding and the stakers were asking for, to make sure their stake was safe. And so we started from fault tolerance into more like node operator expansion. And now we have like these two sort of parallel problems that we're solving.
So your initial problem set was around, I guess, the decentralization. Taking Lido is a good case of that. But also, I guess, it reduces its vulnerabilities, right, of single points of failures, and then private key compromise, obviously, because of the DVT stack, and then slashing penalties. So one of the interesting things that I was looking at when I was looking at Obol, like this was like 2-3 years ago, was and I think this is one of the secret sauce, and I would love for you to like expand on this. I'm sure we're going to get to this later on, but your middleware implementation, right? Would like to know if that middleware implementation was a result of the fact of like, guys, we got to get these guys both to work. There's no one's going to adopt this whole stack and then run it themselves. So we need to think of something that's kind of like a translator, something that'll be in the middle, that'll work for these guys. I would love to know how you came upon that realization. Like usually teams and founders and like engineers come upon these things through like, I'm looking at this problem, I can't see the trees in the forest. I would like to see how you saw that or came upon that.
Yeah. I'm not an engineer myself, but I think I can try to answer that on behalf of the engineering team, and they might message me after this. But I think if you look at Web 2, there is this concept of microservices, right, that are sort of depending on each other and serve like very specific functions. And so Ethereum, in my opinion, has always evolved in that direction of having like small minimalistic software that works very well with the other parts of the stack, but that does one function very well. And so that's why we decided to just be like fast, composable with anything, with any of the clients middleware that you could just plug into your current stack, which is the execution client, your consensus client, and your validator client. And so we would sit right there in the middle, and you could just plug us in or remove us if you don't want to. And I think there's a couple advantages with that. The first is the composability. People can keep using like the clients that they're used to for the other parts of the stack. And we don't take the risk of touching other areas that we might not be experts on. The validator keys, for example, we can't access them. As a middleware, we're just like aggregating them. That's still the job of the validator client. I know other distributed validators implementation do touch these things and put them on chain. We decided to stay minimalistic, do exactly what we're good at, be composable, and stay true to the spirit of not having to introduce risk where we don't have to. Now, that's not always easy, right? Maintaining all these different composability. There is like 5 consensus clients, 5 execution clients. Sometimes that's hard for the engineering team to make sure all the standards fit with each other. But I think it was the right architectural choice in terms of minimizing risk. And that's what we're also seeing now from like more sophisticated actors like the institutions. They do require that higher level of security that I think is harder once you have like a fatter stack that you're trying to maintain. Now, I do want to caveat that we're hearing a bit more now the thesis of like the fat app. The fat app is how you capture value. That's how you capture the users. And I think that's true, but that's true when you have a direct line to the users. And that's why you have projects like, let's say, Infinex that want to take down Binance, or DeFi.app. They're really trying to provide this like nice app that does everything and looks super slick and own the users, right? But for infrastructure projects where you're still a bit removed from the users, whether you like it or not, I think there is more risk trying to capture that directly and creating software that might be a fork of something that you need to start maintaining. So big fan of the fat app if you have access to the users, but if you're in the back end, I think it's actually probably safer to stay more composable and modular with the rest of the stack.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because I've had the pleasure and displeasure of working in like not only ETH, but ADA and DOT, and now Dogecoin and Bitcoin. It's my own retarded journey. Someday you'll probably hear it as on C-SPAN as they try and throw me in jail. But like that being said, I think this unique culture of core competency and modular frameworks is very critical to Ethereum. It's one of the biggest successes, I think, that makes it so long lasting. Even though ETH is acting like basically a stable coin right now in terms of price action, right? It doesn't move. But like that being said, I think one of the cool things that builders like is that, hey, and I think that we all benefited from this approach, right? This culture where it's like you can whole ass one thing, don't half ass two things. And that gives the room for people to be like, I'll be great at this and I'll let you plug in. And this is going to be good for you and good for me. And it's kind of cool that you guys use that culture as the impetus to be like, we should think about a middleware solution for this so that these two parties that otherwise would not think about trust can come into this program that can do this. The second part of the first part of my question, sorry here, was like to ask about that. Now you mentioned that we're evolving to another problem. I think we're jumping a little bit, but unfortunately my mind is just schizophrenic. Who knows? Maybe I am schizophrenic in reality. But like that being said, I would love to know what is the problem that you have now evolved to solve?
Yeah. So definitely the second one I was mentioning there in terms of increasing the number of node operators. Again, Lido increased by 10x the number of node operators, same for EtherFi, but also inclusion of more diverse groups of people in these node operator sets, especially solo stakers, which is something very dear to the Ethereum community. You can finally trust them with some like professional stake. Like the EtherFi solo staker program is a good one there, where to be honest, I think most like serious capital would not trust a hobbyist at home with their stake. And I understand that. But if it's like 5 hobbyists and if one of them, their machine breaks down, maybe that's like more okay in terms of tolerating the risk. So it's also being able to include these like solo stakers that are very important and that are the last line of defense for Ethereum, let's be honest, right? Once Coinbase decide they're not aligned, they won't be aligned, right? Everyone knows that. And they're one of the biggest validators today. So the last line of defense and the only reason Ethereum is credibly neutral today and is resistant to attacks is because of those solo stakers. So being able to include them in these protocols, and that means for them to make more money and for their business to be viable as well, which is you need to allow people to make money, otherwise they don't engage typically in these like crypto incentives-based systems, let's say. That's also something very important. So increasing the number, but also the diversity and the inclusion of node operators. And then the initial part of just the security, not having slashing, just having more performance, more uptime. That's still like top of mind for the top tier validators like Blockdaemon, like Bitcoin Suisse. All these people that are going to be running like the super serious stake that's going to come in through the staking ETF. They want 99.999% uptime, right? And so there is no way you can do that unless you take risk without a DV setup. Otherwise, you have these backups, as we say, and then you run the risk of slashing. And if any of these operators get slashed once, there is no chance they ever get stake again. So for them, like security is top of mind. So that means uptime rewards. Yeah, so it's really both sides at the same time. Increasing operators and then really added security.
I have one more question. I actually have a lot of questions. I feel like you and me can chat all day long. One of the funny things is like, I have a lot of questions because I think we weren't recording, but I'll share it over here. Full disclosure, I applied for a job at Obol and they said, you're too dumb to work here. No, they were like, I had a chance to meet the founders and they were actually super cool. I just think that at that time, I wasn't ready for the whole infra world, but like, it was really cool. Actually, the person who you have in the job, we were talking about this, he's the guy who actually helped set this all up. It's come full circle now. But I wanted to dig in a little bit about, so this libp2p com stack, right? Which is basically part of your ability for Kayron which Kayron is the middleware software stack that you guys are looking at to allow for these people to communicate. So there are some cool things about obviously what this does, right? Like we mentioned that. But I wonder, is there a limit in terms of the node clusters that form as a result of this approach? This architecture fundamentally requires you to be like, oh, once we hit this threshold here, it's kind of like, oh, now it's hard to scale this. So how do we scale, or how are you dealing with that scaling problem? Because like you said, institutions are coming in. They may have a certain degree of centralization that's there, but core to the Ethereum ethos, the idea is to make the small person and the big person have equal value of stake based on putting things in there, but also keep that decentralization. How do you think about that?
Cool. I'll actually start by the end there. I'm starting to hate the word decentralization. I think this was very bad marketing from engineers at the beginning of a project, which is often what happens, right? Engineers build something cool and then they use engineering terms. And I think decentralization word means nothing to no one. And that's why I prefer to refer to security or uptime, because these are words that actually drive value. No one cares about decentralization. It's not value per se, right? So I'll start there in terms of why we want the small guys and the big guys and have access. It's for security. It's not because we're ideologues about decentralization. Decentralization matters for credibility, neutrality, and then for security. Now, in terms of the design there, in terms of P2P and scalability, that's a very interesting one. So the way we work is that every cluster, so once you distribute a validator between a certain number of operators, you become a cluster. And every cluster is fully independent. And that's unique to our implementation of DVT. And that means it's actually much faster as well to operate because you don't need to communicate with an outside network. Let's say if I needed to send on another blockchain, I've signed my part of the signature, please find it. That's going to take a lot of back and forth and time for people to communicate. The way we've implemented it is like, I'm directly talking to you. If you're part in my cluster, I know your IP address, I'm directly sending it to you, and we operate in isolation, right? So we can be like super fast and efficient, which helps with the scalability then of the clusters as well. So direct connections, something quite important in terms of performance. And then in terms of how many nodes can you have in a cluster, let's say, what we're seeing is typically 4 and 7 are the sweet spots. For the security to be sort of at the highest, you need 2/3. That's like the Byzantine threshold, as it's called. So it's a 3 out of 4 for a 4-node setup, or a 5 out of 7 for a 7-node setup. In that case, 2 nodes can go down as long as 5 are still up and running and doing their duties. I think we've run up to 30 nodes in a cluster, but at some point you also get like decreasing returns in terms of the security that you get, right? So I think in our case of Lido, they do 5 out of 7. So that means 2 can go down. For more professional node operators that know what they're doing, they just do 3 out of 4 because 1 going down is already pretty rare. So it's okay if 1 goes down, they can sleep the night and then fix it in the morning. But if I think very long term, and that's something I sometimes get excited, I know Vitalik has this vision of everyone validating from their phone, right? Like you start your phone and you start validating. There is no way you can do that without distributed validators. So I imagine this like mega cluster, let's say 100 people in the cluster, and you just need like 60, let's say 66 people online and doing proper stuff for the cluster to run. And then as soon as you start your phone, it joins the cluster, does a number of things. You get like small rewards that pays for your Twitter subscription or for your phone plan or whatever. And then you shut down your phone and you leave the cluster. And it's just like these mega clusters that are sort of always ongoing and fluent and fluid. So that's sort of the vision. And I don't see why Obol couldn't support that one day. But I think the client teams have more work to do on the light client and the phone thing before we get there. But scalability, I think, could go to, up to 100 nodes if we wanted to, thanks to this minimalistic and direct connections design.
So just to dumb it down for someone like me, it's kind of like you have Ethereum, then you have the validators underneath that. And then underneath that, you'd have the Chiron middleware, right? Which is Obol's middleware, libp2p stack. From there, it hits a cluster. And in that cluster, there's ideally 5 to 7 nodes that are there. Now, you're saying that clustering part with the validator that's there would be like Lido, DappRadar, EtherFi, all these other people that are there. That's the layer they are. And they're using Obol as a way to basically further decentralize it underneath this way between individual parties and like bigger parties. Is that an accurate representation of the architecture?
Very close, very close. So Ethereum at the top is correct.
God damn it, I'm not getting a job again.
And then you have the protocols like Lido and EtherFi that have stake, that have ETH to distribute to the operators. Typically, they just distribute it to one person that's running one machine, let's say. One person, one machine. One person, one machine, every time in chunks. Now with DVs, instead of distributing to one person, they group them by groups of 4 and distributed the stake. And each of these person and their machine is running Chiron and is connecting within their cluster with the other Charon middleware. So they each have an implementation of Charon, talk to each other, but each cluster working for each protocol is completely isolated and means fully scalable and performance. Not affected. Let's say there was a big bug in one of the other cluster. You're not affected, right? So it's also like a dependency risk that's minimized there.
That's pretty cool. And I have to ask, in this architecture, as you shard this even further, I know that might not be the right engineering term for it, but it looks like it's like a Merkle tree. It breaks down further and further, right? In that case, how do you think about latency, especially in the area where you're saying like, hey, Vitalik's vision is to like basically be like, I want this to be done on your phone. So you have a cell tower. That cell tower is basically, as soon as you come onto that cell tower, you're basically on that network and connecting the signal. But obviously, as you break this down further, there's a lot of pipeline flow and signing flow that needs to occur. How do you think about that?
That's a good question. So Ethereum today is obviously one of the slowest network out there with 12-second block times. It's actually 4 seconds for the block itself and for the proposal to be done. And we'll see how that evolves. I think DEF is pushing for sure the block times. I think that makes sense. We want the layer 1 to scale. Obviously, it's never going to be as performant as DL2s, and I'm still supportive of DL2s being like super fast and with pre-commits, etc. Like you can get like instant confirmation even if DL1 or DL2 has actually longer block times. But ultimately, it's all like the upper or lower bound is defined by the speed of internet. And so depending on where your nodes in the clusters are, you can go lower in terms of latency or you can't. If you have one node in Australia and then one in the US, it might take 200, 300 milliseconds for that connection to be made. And because these nodes are connecting with each other, you might need to go there and back and forth. So that increases a bit the latency. Now, do you need the cluster to be this geographically distributed? Maybe not. Maybe it's okay if you're just like 2 in Europe, 2 in the US. That's about 50 milliseconds, maybe 100 if you're a bit in remote places. So that's already much faster, right? So you can distribute geographically, but you don't have to go to the other side of the world either. There is always diminishing returns with these things. Depends what you look for. Now, there are a couple more advanced internet protocol. I forgot the name now. I think there is one they're raising at the moment that's promising even faster speeds than the current like optic fibers of the internet. So we'll see how that changes things. But so today, Obol is not really like slowing down or the Ethereum like blocks, right? They're already so long that we have plenty of time to do what we need to do, and we'll see how that evolves. And they can reduce by 4, and I think we'll still be fine. And that would be a huge like UX improvement. So nothing to worry there. And then the consensus clients that's also used for the nodes within the cluster to communicate and make sure they agree with each other. These like algorithms are always evolving as well. There is stuff like hot stuff that it's called, and cryptography keeps evolving. So we can come to consensus within the cluster faster and faster. So I expect latency to decrease as Ethereum becomes more performant and more and better technologies come online. So that's not a big concern for us.
Yeah, I appreciate you digging into that. Sorry, it's just like we went down a rabbit hole. We were like talking like, is this going to be super technical in the beginning? And we're like, nah. And it's like, yo, boom, right off the bat. You're like, the dumb guy comes in with the questions. Sorry, but yeah.
Yeah, so I did have one other question on that side. So I think I have a good understanding of how that works for like a larger organization like a Lido or something like that. Can we dig into like the solo staker use case a little bit more? So let's say I have 32 ETH. I want to run a machine. How does it work for me to do that?
Cool. Yeah. So indeed, if you have your own capital, or let's say the three of us, we have 32 ETH between the three of us, we could form a cluster. So you just go to launchpad.obol.org. We each put like our address or Ethereum address. We pull the funds, let's say on a multisig, we deposit that, and it then is going to get staked within the configuration of the cluster that we have all signed. So you need to know your counterparties in this case, right? Like I know your address, you know my address, I send you the invite. Hopefully we have like a Telegram chat where we can coordinate. And so as long as you know the people as a solo staker, it's pretty easy. You go to the website, you put the addresses, you pull the funds, and then you start Chiron on your machine. And we have a number of like super easy method to deploy your nodes. Now that I'm saying this, we even have better ways. For example, if you own a DApp node, which is something a lot of the home stakers and solo stakers have, or an Avado, these are like machines where it's just like click and play. You just select execution client, consensus client, or you want to also have like a distributed validator through Obol, click here. And most of the job is done for you. You reference who your friends are, and your DApp node just starts running Obol. So it's a very similar setup, except that you're providing the capital yourself. And for a lot of home stakers, that's just the peace of mind. These people have jobs, and like, as I said, go on holidays. Like most of the time today, with the number of validators on the network, you propose only one block per year, and that's a lot of your APR for the year. Like if you miss your block, you're gonna wait another long year. So these people don't want to miss their block. And so if they're in a cluster, they know that if they go down or if they don't have internet, they miss the upgrade. For home stakers, it's really like this peace of mind that we see is really the value driver for them. Because they have the capital, but most of the time, they're not always like up to date with everything that's happening. And that's where sometimes, issues happen.
Yep, that makes a ton of sense. Very cool. So I wanted to chat just a little bit more about some of the work that you're doing. So you're the CEO of the Obol Association. Maybe let's talk a little bit more about the association itself and kind of what the mission there is and kind of how that empowers Obol and that kind of thing.
Well, that part's not super exciting. My job is to destroy my job within 2 years. So
you're going to immolate yourself, like literally at the end. It's going to be like the Buddhist monk style. He's like, and that's it.
Correct. So I think you're just pretty familiar with the regulatory landscape that we've had for the last few years, right? Especially in the US. And so a lot of projects have set up some sort of foundation or association. For us, that's in Switzerland, to be able to perform a number of actions with their token and involve the community and give incentives, etc. But the goal of these is, like, let's say, entities, it's not to have control. Like, on the contrary, it's actually to give control to the community. And so my goal is, within 2 to 3 years, that we don't need the Obol Association anymore, and that the Obol Collective is within the hands of the collective itself. Now, we've also seen other projects that try to decentralize too fast, also like kind of go to shit, if I can say this on the pod. It's tricky, right? Like initially you do your TG, you do your airdrop, you think everyone like knows your project and is super motivated. The reality is that 3 months later, they don't care anymore. And so if they have all the power, that's also how your project can die. So what you want is to go towards like progressive decentralization, and progressively, as your community grows, as there are more skills, as you have grant programs and community members, then you can remove yourself progressively. So that's the journey I'm on. That's my job, establishing all this foundation so that the community can take control. So what does that mean today? We got inspired by Optimism, the way they govern their OP chain. And I don't know if you're super familiar with the Optimism framework, but they have like two houses. On the one side, they have what they call the token house, which is where OP token holders just vote on their regular like protocol and your classic like token-based governance for grants and proposals, treasury, that kind of stuff. And then they have this citizens house that takes care of voting on retroactive funding. And that's something we're also like super interested in. How can we give back to Ethereum, as it's this like infinite garden that we thrive on, and we feel like we should give back as well. And so we also have what we call then for us the RAF, which is this like second, let's say, governance house where the Obol token holders can decide where retroactive funding goes. So today we have like these two governance houses. They have some power. The association has some power, with the goal to probably dissolve and give more to the community over time.
Very cool. Yeah, and I think that makes a ton of sense. I mean, because to your point, I think if you decentralize too fast, it definitely, people don't have enough time to kind of get a sense of the mission, become committed to it, that kind of thing. So I think that slow approach is good, and it kind of makes sure that, you know, when you are ready to hand it over, it's in a good place. So I think that's really good.
I got to ask a question here. So in OP, you mentioned there's like the token house, the citizen house, right? There's these two sides of the house, right? This bicameral system, right, that's there could lead to sometimes like deadlocks or inefficiencies. We're replicating that system here. I'm wondering, how do you think about that? Have you those risks, and how do you think about changing those risks for the Obol system?
I actually think two house system, or bicameral, as you say, that's a feature, not a bug. So on purpose, we gave each house like a veto right on the other. They can't like govern the stuff that the other one is doing, right? But they can put a veto, right? If things are really going to shit. So I think that's actually like a check on balance that's useful. Sure, it's additional overhead, but at the end of the day, I think it's probably positive to separate like functions the same way any government like separate functions, right? You have the executive branch, legislative branch, legal branch, yeah, whatever. So I think that actually makes sense. And I wouldn't be afraid of replicating human systems of governance that work. I think sometimes crypto try to reinvent too much. Governance has always existed for humans for like thousands of years. There is a reason it evolved the way it did. I'm all for bringing that governance on chain, increasing the transparency, the accountability of the users, but I don't think that we necessarily need to also reinvent the structure of how humans organize. I think blockchains are more useful for the transparency part and for the accountability part.
That's a fair response. Thank you.
So I do want to dig into the Obol Collective a little bit as well. So kind of with the vision of kind of them doing a lot of these things, what kind of, I guess, maybe let's talk about their current state and then kind of where you see the collective going over time.
Yeah, cool. In terms of numbers, I think that's probably a good place to start. 2023 was like our first validator on mainnet. So we say like the first million in TVL, let's say. 2024 was the first billion. And for this year, 2025, we're looking at 10 to 20 billion in TVL. If the price of ETH is willing to help, we'll see. But yeah, so today we have about like 1% of the Ethereum stake. We're also expanding to Monad. We'll see when their mainnet goes, but there seems to be a lot of traction there on testnet. And then we also have support from Gnosis chain. But going back to this like notion of the middleware, the good news is that this can be ported to many chains because it's just middleware. We're not in the business of solving like all the scalability of Solana, right? Like we're just a middleware. So that concept of just aggregating BLS signatures from different nodes and pushing that consensus to a different layer of the consensus of that chain can be really applied to different ways. Of course, different chains, different constraints, but in general, different chains make sense. Now, Ethereum is still the largest total addressable market in terms of stake. Like people keep like shitting on Ethereum, but it's still the big boy in the room in terms of proof of stake. So it still makes sense. That's where we started, and that's why we're aiming for 10 to 20 billion this year in stake. That's distributed validators. And then in parallel, that's a bit of alpha, let's say, for you guys. What we realized is we actually have a lot of qualified people, these operators that I've been referring to since the beginning. These are people that we start to get to know. We know they're good at running software. They're good at working with the protocols like Lido, EtherFi. And then we also know there is like decentralized networks or applications like restaking AVSs, AI agents, like inference AI stuff, like DAO. There is all these apps, software that actually needs decentralized operators. They realize there is an opportunity to leverage like blockchains to increase the transparency and like remove the intermediaries of their operations, all these apps. But they don't want to spin up their own blockchain, let alone even L2 is probably too much for them. But what they could do is just leverage our set of operators, which are used to actually run decentralized software. So I think one of the vision for Obol is to transform from just running distributed validators to running any app. And we're just like a marketplace between operators that we've certified that we know are good at running distributed software, not just validators, and then apps that are looking at deploying across many different operators. And then you would log into your UI and say, okay, today I want to be running this validator, maybe a grass node, like an AI node, and you make a bit of like extra income with the latent resources on your node. Because that's the other thing. A lot of these like machines have latent like resources or compute that could be leveraged for other things. And we're thinking about bridging these two worlds. So that's like probably the bigger vision that I'm quite excited about. Distributed validators being still the first thing that's part of that network and still very much intending to scale it up.
Very cool. So just to make sure I understand that. So you'd kind of envision having it be not just, for Ethereum or Monad, but if I just needed compute in general. So let's say I was running, validator for another chain and I just needed access to the hardware or software. Y'all would have a marketplace where I could do that?
Correct. If you want operators that know how to run software, Like, this is the initial problem that was with Cosmos, for example. Every time these Cosmos chains needed to spin up their own validator sets. And that was like a big overhead. Not only finding the people, and then you needed to pay the people, and there was that whole stuff. And so L2s came along saying, cool, then you can just have a centralized server. But for a lot of the apps, it's not just about execution. They generally want like a decentralized set of nodes providing the data. Filecoin, for example, right? Like they're relying on decentralized storage. And so if Filecoin were to came about today, they could say, oh, look, there is all these like Obol nodes that are already running validators for Ethereum, but they each have like half a terabytes of data left on these nodes. They don't know what to do. And so as an operator, I could just say, oh, Filecoin is offering me like, I don't know, $5 a month to leverage that half a terabytes on my machine on top. And so I just click opt in from my UI. And so I'm running the validator for Ethereum, but also running like a Filecoin storage part. And so you can increase your income as an operator. And then Filecoin is also happy because they know that these people, if you're already validating for Ethereum, you're probably like a good operator and you're not going to drop and erase the disk like all of a sudden, right?
Very cool. No, I think that's really interesting. So I'm real deep into the Avalanche ecosystem, and right now, if you're following them closely, a lot of what they're doing is focusing on L1s that they're launching. And I think for a lot of folks, they don't necessarily want to run the hardware themselves, but a lot of demand for it. So I actually have a few validators running on one of the Avalanche L1s that I'm paying $40 a month for, basically. So if there was a marketplace where I could look at other validators or other providers with good uptime, all that kind of thing, I think that would be huge.
Yeah, that's spot on. I need to look more into Avalanche then. Well, I was a big guy and then I got burned by Danny and friends on
Oh no.
Wonderland. So that was the end of it for me on Avalanche.
Yeah, I came in a little after the Wonderland, but I've heard so many stories of what's happened with that. So
But it was
all
fun
of the
though.
OGs definitely know about that.
It was fun. It was fun. We don't make protocols like those anymore.
Right. So very cool. Awesome. So one other thing I did want to touch on. So I know y'all recently launched a token, I believe, right? So the Obol token. Maybe let's talk just a little bit about that and kind of how that functions in the Obol world.
Cool. Yeah, so we did our airdrop about 2 months ago. It's following a similar model than Eigenlayer, where you have your tokens, but they're locked. So we kind of wanted to separate the airdrop from the listing, just so that people get more familiar with what you can do with your token before you get distracted with price, which we know then people get overly distracted with that. So the first thing that you can do with your token, even if they're locked, is engage in that governance that we were chatting about earlier. So you can actually vote on proposals or vote on projects that should receive some of that retroactive funding. And so that's how, yeah, DAppNode, Protocol Guild, Ethereum on ARM, we gave like about 1 million Obol tokens through that retroactive funding. That was quite cool. And those are people with the Obol tokens that were able to vote on it, even if the token is not trading yet. In the token house, they also voted on a couple of more interesting proposals, like enabling staking for the Obol token so that it can accrue revenue. And then they also actually voted to tell the association, please go list the token. So that's what I'm keeping busy with right now. So 2 types of governance. Now staking will be enabled because the community voted for it. And then the last piece, which is quite interesting, is a programmatic incentives. So anyone running like Obol as part of their Ethereum nodes and who's making their typical like APR will get like a number of Obol tokens on top of it to boost the APR. And the reason we're doing this, if you've been following this long, you understand there is humans and machines involved, and that it's a bit more infrastructure heavy than your typical like DeFi pool where you just move capital around. It's super like mercenary. In the case of validators, there are machines somewhere that someone is operating. And the validator literally needs to be almost physically migrated. And so that takes a bit of effort. And so we actually want to reward the people that are early to that migration. That's Obol is tested, ability. We want to incentivize people to move over. And we understand that there is a bit of like work and lift to do that sort of migration. So that's why we're giving 2.5% of the Obol supply per year in equal chunks every week to people running Obol. So initially, when there isn't that much TVL, you actually get like a pretty decent boost. And as more and more validators come online that are running Obol, then the APR will go down. But the goal is still that you find definitely some value by running Obol. And so that's the last piece around programmatic incentives. And then the community can propose anything else, right? Like, I hope we have like amazing DeFi integrations, post listing, and all sort of things. I'm sure they'll come up with creative things in the forum in terms of what to do with token.
I have a question about this. It's really interesting when I hear you talk about sharing with Luke about your validator expansion and then going into Monad and these other places. It feels like, and earlier on this week, we have a member of the DAO, ATX DAO, Jonathan Libby, who's part of Gauntlet. They had a very interesting story as well, right? Their story came from like a research hub that then went on to help do strategies. And now they expanded, right? Kind of like in your story of, at least it's like with Obol, it seems like we had this idea of research to solve this problem. We started solving this problem. Now we've evolved to solve this problem. And they've gone from like research as a service to like now you guys kind of going to like infrastructure as a service that can expand, which is really interesting. I wonder, if me being a retard and a degen, have you ever thought about financial instrumentation around Obol itself and these validators? Essentially, there's a lot of financial instrumentation that we use from like traditional markets. You mentioned that you're originally in Dublin. It's also not only a powerhouse for tech, but it's a powerhouse for finance, right? And also in London as well. I'm sure you're aware of a lot of these crazy instruments that are there. Have you thought about that? Or is the community like, is there some retard in the community? It's like, bro, we need to pair Obol token with the most ridiculous like degen token of Warpcaster, and we'll create like this new kind of instrument around it. And that's just like an index. But like, I'm just wondering, have you guys thought about something like that? Or is there people in the community asking for these new kind of instrumentation?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. One that we've been exploring for a while that I find super interesting is tokenizing the validator itself, right? So we're talking about there is infrastructure, right? There is someone running stakes somewhere. Well, we know what blockchains are good at. It's actually abstracting stuff away and being able to certify the ownership of something and give it to someone else through smart contracts. So I think tokenizing validators so that they can be exchanged rather than you having to withdraw the ETH, get it back in your wallet, deposit it with someone else. I think that's super interesting. So you could imagine like almost like a machine going from Lido to EtherFi, right? By having that tokenized as an NFT or something like that. So I think that's more on the exotic kind of interesting stuff. In terms of bonds and pools, I know in the 2020 era, it was like super like fancy of having like a business model that's centered around your token. And I think a lot of projects are actually moving away from that and back to let's be equity business and give the revenue back to the token. Which was also the beginning in the 2017 cycle. It was also equity business. Then we moved to 2020 with token-based business, and now we're back into equity business. And I think a lot of business tried too hard last cycle to make it around their token with the sort of bonds that you're describing, where, for example, Rocket Pool, you need to put like RPL tokens to be able to run the node. SSV was also doing like distributed validators, also have this sort of bond mechanism. And what we're seeing is all these protocols are moving away from that because it just brings way too much friction in the way their software operates, in the way, like, it has nothing to do with the value of the product in the end. It's sort of like artifacts that you try to create around your business to create sort of supply sinks. But the reality is those things were artificial. So you saw actually people borrowing these tokens instead of really using them, etc. And so a lot of these businesses are actually, or protocols, dismantling all these models of like super fancy like bonds and that kind of stuff. So I think we'll stay away from that for a while and instead make revenue, which we do through the 1% of staking rewards, and then distribute that through the token if there is a regulatory framework that allows us to do it. Today, it's still definitely a gray zone, but we're seeing changes there. Like I think MakerDAO has started like buybacks heavily. Aave as well. So all the big protocols are now enabling their fee switch or buyback programs. So I think this is more the route to go rather than a fancy pools or derivatives. But tokenizing validators, still something we're interested in. And then the one that's maybe more there on the frontier that I'm personally excited is the Obol staking that I was referring to earlier. So this has nothing to do with the ETH staking we've been talking about until now. This is you staking your Obol tokens and you get like staked Obol. And what happens in the meantime, it's leveraging the Tally protocol, so Tally, the governance framework, so that your tokens are delegated while they are staked you get your derivative, let's say staked Obol, which you can use in DeFi. You can put it into a Morpho vault that's created by Gauntlet, as you say, borrow USDC against it. And originally, the problem with that setup was as soon as you move your tokens in DeFi, they lose their governance power. So that means people cannot vote. And you guys run a DAO, you still want people to vote. And if these tokens are locked into a vault making an APR somewhere, they're not making any money. Well, they're making money, but then they're not voting. And so you always have DeFi and governance like opposing forces. And through the Tally protocol, and so the way it's implemented for us as staking, it's not competing anymore. And I find that like a super interesting new paradigm of thinking about how governance and DeFi can enable each other rather than compete with each other. So yeah, I went a bit in the various directions in terms of fancy things you can do with tokens, but hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. And I also appreciate the fact that, it's kind of like Uniswap has done this itself, right? Where it's like, guys, we're sending the fees back to the token holders. This is a very direct value flow that is understandable and palatable to gigabrains, like to Ripple brainers and smooth brainers, right? That makes a lot of sense. And also it makes a lot of sense to me for you to be like, yo, we're creating these complicated sync mechanisms that we don't even know how the fuck we're going to project this, since everything is shifting. A month in crypto is like a year in the real world, right? Because there's so many components and our tech is just on the frontier. We're building this as we're doing it. So it makes a lot of sense. And the cash flow stuff around validators also makes a lot of sense. I mean, ultimately, it is a business that can be basically tokenized and be like, bro, we should be able to tap into these cash flows. Like, this is smart. And it's a hard asset, right? Like, the very rare moats of crypto seems to be around soft assets and like fugazi internet magic money, like Wonderland, as we mentioned. But like that being said, like this makes a lot of sense to me. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Very cool. So, so let's talk just a little bit more about if folks are interested in kind of getting involved in Obol, whether in the community side of things or if they are looking to validate or even liquid staking, which protocols use y'all. Maybe talk just a little bit about that.
Cool. Yeah. So the way I like to think about Obol within protocols is a bit the same way about Intel Inside. If you're familiar, where you buy a computer and you have like this little sticker that says you have like an Intel chip in it, right? And you kind of know it's going to be a good computer. Obviously, it depends what the chip says, but you kind of trust the Intel stuff. At least that's how it was 10 years ago before Macs came back, let's say, and everyone were on PCs. And so I think kind of the same way with protocols where you're deciding to stake. Choose the protocols that have DVs, because that means your stake is going to be more safe, is going to be more uptime. That means more rewards for you. There is less risk of like that protocol getting hacked or that operator getting hacked. That's if I have stake, even if I don't care about anything else, I think it's just more safe to choose these protocols. Anything else, everything else equal. But so today, Lido is leveraging distributed validators. EtherFi is on the restaking front. We just announced recently with Swill. And so these are on the liquid staking. And then you just have also vanilla staking with things like Chorus with our Stakewise. So if you go to obol.org/incentives, you'll see there all the partners you can stake with. And as I said, we just launched our incentives program. So actually, besides just getting better security as a staker, you also get like a nice APR boost depending on the price of Obol once we list, which is the next thing to look at. We're actively looking at exchanges to list the ASAP. So can't talk much more about that, but stay tuned for the listing announcement as well, since this was voted by the DAO to proceed.
Awesome. Very cool. And you'll have a lot of educational materials out there as well. I know, Green Pill does a whole lot with the YouTube and that kind of thing. If folks do want to learn more in that sense, what's a good place for them to look at as well?
The website is obol.org, obol.org. And then our Twitter is also pretty good. So that's Obol_collective.
Deal. Well, Toma, this has been awesome having you on, man. This is super interesting, the work that y'all are doing. If folks want to follow you, what's the best way for them to stay in touch with some of the stuff that you're doing, whether on socials or otherwise?
Yeah, the Obol Collective, definitely. And that's where I would start. They often retweet me, so it shouldn't be so hard to find
deal.
the stuff that I post.
Awesome. Well, very cool. Well, again, Toma, thanks again for joining us, and looking forward to having y'all back sometime.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the ATX DAO Podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate, subscribe, and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. To learn more about ATX DAO, visit us at atxdao.com and follow us on X, Farcaster, and LinkedIn at ATX DAO. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.